was obvious that Hitler had studied American eugenics laws. In fact, in his book, Black says Hitler studied American eugenics laws. He tried to legitimize his anti-Semitism by medicalizing it and wrapping it in the most palatable pseudoscientific facade of eugenics. Hitler was able to recruit more followers among reasonable Germans by claiming that science was on his side. While Hitler's race hatred sprung from his own mind, the intellectual outlines of the eugenics Hitler adopted in 1924 were made in America. During the 20s, Carnegie Institute eugenics scientists cultivated deep personal and professional relationships with Germany's fascist eugenicists. In Mein Kampf, published in 1924, Hitler quoted American eugenics ideology and openly displayed a thorough knowledge of American eugenics. There is today one state, wrote Hitler, in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of immigration are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model of German republic, but the United States. Hitler proudly told his comrades just how closely he followed the progress of the American eugenics movement. I've studied with great interest, he told a fellow Nazi, the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would in all probability be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock. Hitler even wrote a fan letter to American eugenics leader Madison Grant, calling his race-based eugenics book, The Passing of the Great Race, his Bible. Hitler's struggle for a superior race would be a mad crusade for a master race. Now the American term Nordic was freely exchanged with Germanic or Aryan. Race science, racial purity, and racial dominance became the driving force behind Hitler's Nazism. Nazi eugenics would ultimately dictate who would be persecuted in a Reich-dominated Europe, how people would live, and how they would die. Nazi doctors would become the unseen generals in Hitler's war against the Jews and other Europeans deemed inferior. Doctors would create the science, devise the eugenic formulas, and even hand-select the victims for sterilization, euthanasia, and mass extermination. During the Reich's early years, eugenicists across America welcomed Hitler's plans as the logical fulfillment of their own decades of research and effort. California eugenicists republished Nazi propaganda for American consumption. They also arranged for Nazi scientific exhibits, such as the 1934 display at the L.A. County Museum for the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association. That same 10 years after Virginia passed its Sterilization Act, Joseph de Arnett, superintendent of Virginia's Western State Hospital, observed in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, "The Germans are beating us at our own game. More than just providing the scientific roadmap, America funded Germany's eugenic institutions. By 1926, Rockefeller had donated more than $410,000, almost $4 million in 21st century money, to hundreds of German researchers. In May 1926, Rockefeller awarded $250,000 to the German Psychiatric Institute at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, later to become the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry. Among the leading psychiatrists at the German Psychiatric Institute was Ernst Rudin, who became director and eventually an architect of Hitler's systematic medical repression. At the time of Rockefeller's endowment, Ottmar Freiherr von Versier, a hero in American eugenics circles, functioned as the head of the Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. Rockefeller funding of that institute continued both directly and through other research conduits during Versier's early tenure. In 1935, Versier led the institute to form a rival eugenics facility in Frankfurt. That was much heralded in the American eugenics press. Research on twins in the Third Reich exploded, backed up by government decrees. Versier wrote in Der Erstbarts, a eugenic doctor's journal he edited, that Germany's war would yield a total solution to the Jewish problem. Versier had a long-time assistant. His name was Joseph Mengele. On May 30th, 1943, Mengele arrived at Auschwitz. Versier notified the German Research Society, "My assistant, Dr. Joseph Mengele, joined me in this branch of research." And we went through all of that earlier. But just another reminder that Mengele was brought in early in eugenics. That was his main goal was to further the study of eugenics. After the war, eugenics was declared a crime against humanity, an act of genocide. Germans were tried, and they cited the California statutes in their defense. To no avail, they were found guilty. However, Mengele's boss, Verschuur, escaped prosecution. Verschuur reestablished his connection with California eugenicists who had gone underground and renamed their crusade Human Genetics. Typical was an exchange in July 1946 when Popenoe wrote Verschuur, "It was indeed my pleasure to hear from you again. I've been very anxious about my colleagues in Germany. I suppose sterilization has been discontinued in Germany." Popenoe offered tidbits about various American eugenics luminaries and then sent various eugenic publications. In a separate package, Popenoe also sent some coffee, cocoa, and some other goodies. Well, isn't that sweet? Soon, Verschuur once again became a respected scientist in Germany and around the world. In 1949, he became a corresponding member of the newly formed American Society of Human Genetics. Of course, they changed the name, to give it a more palatable title. Human genetics' genocidal roots in eugenics were ignored by a victorious generation that refused to link itself to the crimes of Nazism, and by succeeding generations that never knew the truth of the years leading up to the war. Now, governors of 5 states, including California, have issued public apologies to their citizens in past and present for sterilization and other abuses spawned by the eugenics movement. Human genetics became an enlightened endeavor in the late 20th century. Hard-working, devoted scientists finally cracked the human code through the Human Genome Project. Now, every individual can be biologically identified and classified by trait and ancestry. Yet even now, some leading voices in the genetic world are calling for a cleansing of the unwanted among us and even a master human species. There is an understandable wariness about more ordinary forms of abuse, for example, in denying insurance or employment based on genetic tests. On October 14th, America's first genetic anti-discrimination legislation passed the Senate by unanimous vote. Yet because genetics research is global, no single nation's laws can stop the threats. I think this was written in 2003. 2003. So we see from that not only what were Americans and the British involved, along with the Germans, in eugenics, but also after the war, everything kind of got covered up, and it's still going on today. It's still a threat. And along those lines, I have some quotes from a book called Eugenics, The Eugenics Connection, Shapers of Humanity by Dr. David Reardon. And he goes on to talk about how eugenics changed over a period of time, the attitudes toward it. And he talked about how in the early days it was universally accepted or not universally accepted, but largely accepted in the scientific community in America. During the early 1930s, eugenics reached the height of its popularity in pre-World War II America. It was during this period, when their political power was greatest, that eugenicists and neo-Malthusians became increasingly radical in their demands to eliminate the unfit, whom they called a race of chronic paupers, a race parasitic upon the community. The eugenics weapons to be used in this war between races were increasingly coercive and destructive. In 1932, at the Third International Conference of Eugenics held in New York City, proposals were made to prevent the further dilution of the American gene pool by those who possessed inferior genes through segregation, sterilization, birth control, abortion, and even infanticide. Now, that's loving. Supporting infanticide of the unfit, Dr. Lena K. Sadler, urged her fellow physicians to stop trying to save every child that is born in the world, and urged the medical community to cease free treatment of the unfit baby in our welfare stations, dispensaries, and clinics. For those children who survive postnatal neglect, and for those whose parents refuse to accept the logical practicality of allowing their unfit offspring to die in infancy, she urged the old standby of forced sterilization. It should be noted that Sadler's call for selective infanticide was not directed at children with measurable disabilities alone, but included every weak child, particularly those born to parents of the, quote, unfit class. This is from a book called Legacy of Malthus. It was embedded within the article the book by Reardon. Goes on to talk about how it changed over a period of time. Despite the seemingly universal acceptance of eugenics by educated liberals and wealthy conservatives, by capitalists and socialists, the American enthusiasm for eugenics waned during the 1930s and 40s. This was due in part to advances in the legitimate scientists. As genetic research became increasingly precise and empirical rather than subjective, many geneticists began to recognize that the science of eugenics was less a study of human heredity than it was a systematic rationalization of prejudice against the poor. At the same time, psychologists were beginning to recognize the inherent deficiency in IQ tests. Instead of measuring innate intelligence, they found that mental tests were really only measuring cultural adaptation. Thus, as scientific knowledge advanced, serious geneticists and psychologists were forced to recognize that environmental factors have a far greater impact on an individual's success than does the genetic pattern of one's germ plasm. In short, as the hard facts accumulated, the scientific basis of eugenics seemed increasingly untenable. And then in a quote from a book called Genetics and American Society by Ludmer, but even though serious scientists could no longer believe in eugenics as a science, many still agreed with the eugenics philosophy. Those scientists who did become unsupportive of the eugenics cause generally avoided denouncing their former comrades as frauds. Even in the few geneticists who did take strong stands against eugenics generally limited their opposition to the eugenically inspired immigration laws that were imposed to prevent or curtail the immigration of non-Aryan Europeans, often the relatives of the geneticists themselves, and did little to dispel the myths of scientific racism. Another factor which dampened the American enthusiasm for eugenics was the heightened poverty of the Great Depression. Suddenly, many of those in the upper and middle classes who had previously judged hereditary unfitness on the basis of economic poverty now found themselves impoverished. These new poor feared that the selection of the unfit might be confused, finding themselves labeled the aristocracy of the unfit by eugenicists. They feared that they might be the ones to suffer from compulsory sterilization, not just the truly unfit. Indeed, as noted earlier, it was just that type of broad sterilization program that Roby had called for at the 1932 Eugenics Congress. And here's from a book called Woman's Body, Woman's Right by Gordon. But the biggest setback for the original eugenics movement came with World War II. As the extremes of Nazi eugenic programs became well known, even the most devoted eugenicists became wary of associating themselves with the science, so abused by the German regime. Many eugenicists openly broke ranks, while others simply changed the tone of their rhetoric. Among the latter was Margaret Sanger's American Birth Control League, which carefully chose a new name for its organization. In 1941, the ABCL adopted the new title of Planned Parenthood, and the new neo-Malthusian leaders of the organization carefully began to emphasize an image of peaceful, voluntary, positive eugenics. They replaced the term eugenics with family planning, and old aggressive slogans such as more from the fit, less from the unfit were set aside in deference for less threatening slogans pleading for planned children and reproductive rights. Though the new Planned Parenthood Federation worked diligently to disassociate itself from the word eugenics, however, it never even pretended to extricate itself from the eugenic philosophy from which it was based. Instead, with their revamped vocabulary and scaled-down goals, the leaders of Planned Parenthood, headed by Sanger, continue to work on their agenda of achieving a race of more wanted types and the elimination of unwanted children through peaceful eugenic birth control. In other words, the Nazi death camps had put such a bad light on the idea of eugenics that the cowards that the American Birth Control League decided to change their name and come up with less aggressive slogans to hide what they were really all about, because they were ashamed of what they had been exposed to be.
Also, the Nazis, scientists, while this is all going on with experimentation and slaying of the hindmost, They were also breeding their best officers with what they considered the most genetically fit women. I think one of those places was Lebensborn in France or somewhere.
Yeah, well, it was in Germany.
It was in Germany.
Lebensborn was their program within the SS, and it was sponsored by Himmler. Himmler was really big on it. What they would do is they would find a large number of young girls that of childbearing age, I guess in their late teens, and they would set up these places where the SS members, the young men of the SS, could come and obviously
impregnate,
social interact with them and then copulate with them in the hopes of creating genetically pure, quote unquote, offspring.
I must have seen a show probably 30 years ago or so, and again, I wasn't paying much attention, but that struck me as a little strange. And I think I was watching a show kind of dedicated to the children of those unions, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think that they had a hard time figuring out who their parents were, or at least who their fathers were.
Yeah.
And how many of the offspring of that experiment were still around.
Yeah, I would think that it would be a fairly high number of people because it was one of Himmler's pet projects. It was like a ranch where he could breed thoroughbreds, kind of the way they looked at it.
A whole new meaning to, what was that, what do they call those places, a dude ranch or a stud ranch? But am I...
Yeah, Mustang Ranch, I think, in Nevada.
Yeah. Right. But
we don't want to go too far.
Well, it is what it is. I mean,
Yeah, I hear you.
Somebody has to do the dirty work.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm wondering also, it seemed to me at that time, and I never really looked back at it, but it just was one of those shows that just stayed in my memory because it did shock me. One of those things also, that make you wonder, like, how come I didn't read about this in any books?
Oh, no.
Did there seem to be a preponderance of the women being French?
Being French. Don't know about that.
Okay.
As far as, foreign women, I think the majority of the women that were involved in that program were German women. One thing the Nazis did do is when they went into Eastern Europe, they would find little kids that were, had, quote, Aryan, which I think Aryan is a BS term anyway. It's a pseudo race, but
right.
They would find blonde, blue-eyed children that physically, fit, and they would bring them back to Germany and were given to the German parents. So what they did is they would go in and just take these little babies away from their mothers, just tear them away from them and kidnap them and take them back to Germany, which, if you think about it, is just about as horrific as anything they did. I mean, for a person being a father, knowing how much I love my kids, and especially when they're little like that, for somebody to take them away from you it's just heartless. I mean, it really is. We could go on to some quotations from some of the eugenicists and people involved with it. We were just talking about Margaret Sanger, who is somebody who has been made into a saint in this country and was actually a vicious racist and eugenicist. But here's from a pamphlet was put out by Planned Parenthood. It was a quotation from Margaret Sanger, 1922, back during the period when they weren't worried about how they came across so much. And she made the statement, "The most merciful thing that a family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." I think that was in regards to the, quote, unfit. So here she is just basically straight out endorsing infanticide, which it's just amazing to me that she is held up today as being some kind of a hero or heroine. Here's another loving quote from one of the eugenicists, and it's from Madison Grant, who was a American eugenics writer who Hitler greatly admired, a researcher. And he says, the laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or the race. Well, he's got one thing in there that kind of goes along with the idea of the Nazis and totalitarianism, is collectivism. In other words, the individual has no use unless it's to the community. The individual has no worth. His only worth is in relationship to the community or the race. I think that's as nasty a concept as anybody has ever come up with. Leon F. Whitney, who wrote The Case for Sterilization in 1934, said, if we could purge our country of our typical slum elements in city and country alike, what harm would be done? Why would it not be well worthwhile to include them in the group whom we are weeding out of the population garden? We should probably be disposing of the lowest fourth of our population, and after the economic adjustment, we should hardly miss them at all. But I'm not here suggesting that all these be sterilized wholesale, but merely that we make voluntary sterilization available to them. Those who are too stupid to comprehend or to carry out the simple methods of contraception. Now, you know, it's scary enough to read that kind of commentary from someone who was living back during that era, you know, prior to the Nazis and what they had done, and the world had kind of been confronted with the fruits, so to speak, of eugenics. But here's a quote from a couple of authors that wrote this book in 1977. Adding a sterilant to drinking water or staple foods is a suggestion that seems to horrify people more than most proposals for involuntary fertility control. Indeed, this would pose some very difficult political, legal, and social questions, to say nothing of the technical problems. No such sterilant exists today, nor does one appear to be under development. To be acceptable, such a substance would have to meet other rather stiff requirements. It would be uniformly effective, despite widely varying doses received by individuals, and despite varying degrees of fertility and sensitivity among individuals. It must be free of dangerous or unpleasant side effects, and it must have no effect on members of the opposite sex, children, old people, pets, or livestock. A program of sterilizing women after their second or third child, despite the relative greater difficulty of the operation than vasectomy, might be easier to implement than trying to sterilize men. The development of a long-term sterilizing capsule that can be implanted under the skin and removed when pregnancy is desired opens additional possibilities for coercive fertility control. The capsule could be implanted at puberty and might be removable with official permission for a limited number of births. Well, the people that wrote this were two individuals, John P. Holdren and Paul Ehrlich. John P. Holdren is Barack Obama's science advisor, and Paul Ehrlich was Shrub Bush's science advisor. So right there we see that the last two American presidents, including the current one, have people that are advising them who are basically eugenics proponents.
Yeah, and it also seems like Ehrlich is the standard bearer for it in this in the last couple of decades. If you go to any university or library, and of course you know why I would say that, you know, the science faculty have no shortage of love for Ehrlich.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean they agree with it. I think they do, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a voice that has to be heard. But boy, I tell you what, there's some chilling stuff in that.
Yeah.
But you know, there always has been. They used to bang on, as you've recounted in the last hour or so, they bang on the propagation of unfit or genetically not favored offspring. But now you just have a flat out, and I don't know if you were going there, but of course you're aware of the Jacques Cousteau comment out of UNESCO.
Yeah, I'm aware of it.
No, I hate to say it, but
you know, quote.
You have it?
No, I don't.
Oh,
have
you don't
the
have
quote.
it? Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, I mean I heard that on radio, and I thought that so just over the top, and I said, well, let me take a look, because about 15 feet away from me are the stacks of magazines. So I went to the November issue, whatever year that was, I forget. And I took a look, and there it was, bang. It's hard to say, but it's, but we have to eliminate, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands a day. And the other thing about this whole bit, and it's unfortunate, but radical environmentalism has one of the most nasty components.
Yeah.
And that is in depopulation. And the proponents of such, is it lost on them that, guess what? You're human. Mm-hmm. So maybe you ought to sacrifice yourself for the commonweal. It's just, it is absolutely paradoxical to me.
Well, what I find always interesting and almost amusing is that these people never apply these same standards to themselves or their families or their friends. It's always somebody else who's unfit and somebody else needs to go, and they set themselves as some kind of 10 God who's going to, determine who's going to live and who's going to die.
And, and I'm sorry to say this, but this is something I found out more than I wanted to. Back a couple of years ago, when Terry Schiavo was in suspended animation. Do you remember that case down here?
Yeah, I do. It's really sad.
Oh, and we had on her brother, and we had on Pat Anderson, who was the lawyer at the time. Mm-hmm. But what I found is that, and this is not only in discussions at the university or overhearing stuff, but also reading other material, that the people that were most in favor, and I know this is a generality, but it is what it is, people most in favor of letting her drift were also people that were very big animal rights people.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that animals shouldn't have rights. Not at all. Absolutely not. But there is something that's in this radical environmentalism and animal lovers. There's a part of it that is anti-human. I'm sorry, but it is.
Yeah.
And they were the ones that were most vocal. And I was like, holy crap. And at that time, Harry and I used to talk a lot. I'm going, are you picking this up? He goes, yeah. And I mean, it's sorry, but it's happening in universities. And that's why I'm saying, God help us with what's being pumped out of these universities now, because, and of course, those people, for the most part, if not entirely, are products of the public fool system. It's like, oh, God, truly, oh, God, what are we headed for?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you're going to go further. If you are, let me know. If not, I have a couple of closing questions for you. You tell me how you want to shake this.
Well, I'd like to go a little bit further, and then I'll wrap it up. Sure. Another quote, it's from a book called Human Life International. Brian Close wrote, one of the tactics specified in NSSM 200 was that we might withhold food aid after a disaster if the countries do not accept the American idea of birth control. This has happened many times all over the world. One example is the South American country of Guyana, which was, hit by a hurricane back in 1997. They had turned down abortion and birth control for 12 years straight. But after the hurricane hit Guyana in 1997, the World Bank said, we will not give you any aid unless you legalize abortion and birth control, and that's exactly what they did. I've seen this several times in Africa, where droughts have hit, and the United Nations and the USA will not assist unless they accept birth control. I've been all through Africa myself, and I've seen medical clinics that are full of birth control devices, but no safe motherhood delivery kits. There's no anesthesia. There's not even any bandages there. Instead, there are just crates and crates of birth control pills and condoms. Now, while our commitment to birth control is going up every year, our commitment to authentic economic development is dropping. So we see less clean drinking water funding, less school funding, and less medical clinic funding. Another example is Haiti. Haiti has been hit by hurricanes several times, and the United States and other countries have saturated them with birth control. In Haiti, 90% of the women, at least, can now get access to any kind of birth control they want to. Government funded, but less than 20% of Haitians have access to clean drinking water. Consider what happened after Hurricane Katrina. One of the first things we did was bring in birth control and contraception. The Hewlett Foundation awards $1 million to Planned Parenthood for Katrina evacuees on September 30th, 2005. And as we all know, the hurricane disproportionately affected black families in that area. And I seriously doubt that if the same kind of disaster hit a middle-class white area, the first response would be condoms and birth control.
Oh, yeah.
And one other quotation I have while I'm on the quotations that is just an astounding thing. And I think I believe he speaks for an awful lot of wealthy people who consider themselves liberals, and that's Ted Turner, who used to own CNN and is a major UN donor. A total population of 250 to 300 million people, a 95% decline from present levels would be ideal. Well, Ted, are you going to volunteer to step up and get shot or gassed or whatever? I doubt it seriously, but, he's more than willing to see 95% of the people on the planet, destroyed so that he'll have some room to ride his horsey or whatever.
Hey, how hideous does he have to be to make Jane Fonda run away? I mean, seriously. Boy,
I heard that.
You screwed that up.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to mention, I'm going to take a look into this organization called TED. TED.com you can go to. And it's an anagram, I forget, technology education, I forget what the last thing is. Mm-hmm. I just want to take a look at this because this has, you reminded me when you were talking about, Ted Turner.
Yeah.
But it's got Bill Gates and some other heavy hitters in there, and I think this may be one of those first major steps where when you talk about corporate fascism and such, that all these people are now going to be beholden, contracted to a certain extent, to donate a certain portion of their largesse to making the world a better place. And in the background I can hear that song from Steely Dan. What a wonderful world it will be.
Yeah,
what a glorious time to be free. And I'm like, spandex jackets for everyone. I got it.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, watch this thing if you will. I'm going to do a piece on it for AFP.
Okay.
But this has got all the, this has got the scavats and you give you the shivers and the creeps.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to hit you with this real quick. I got to look into this. But at one of these meetings they had, it's going up top a little bit more because ABC is getting involved, the American Broadcasting Company.
Yeah.
And at one of these talks, Gates let loose a bunch of mosquitoes.
Oh man. Oh man.
I mean, why? So anyway.
Yeah, all of a sudden, Gates, who I guess grew up in a middle class family, and just happened to be a ruthless SOB, and got to be the head of Microsoft. All of a sudden he's setting himself up as some kind of tin god because he made a lot of money, and great. I'm glad for you making the money, but what set you up, to judge on whether other people should live or die? It doesn't set you up as some kind of a god.
Oh yes, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, to them, that's what it is.
Yeah. It's
the heart of darkness.
All of this stuff is so satanic. I mean, it's just absolutely blatantly satanic, but they can't see it, or some of them do. I think a lot of the people in the general public don't, but I think a lot of them are just Satanists. But you're talking about corporate fascism, and that was a good lead-in for the last thing I have here. And this is from Jerry Leonard.
Sometimes I just get lucky.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
We're hitting on all cylinders here. This is from Hitler's Winning by Jerry Leonard.
Yep.
Excerpt from AIDS as the Fulfillment of the Nazi Eugenic Program. And he writes, not only was the international eugenics movement influential in creating the Nazi Holocaust, but a core group of U.S. industrialists, such as the Rockefellers and Carnegies, funded this eugenics movement, as well as helped arm Germany prior to and during and after World War II. One of the best books summarizing this long-suppressed account of how the Nazis rose to power in Germany with U.S. aid and trade is Treason's Peace by Howard Watson Armbruster. In this remarkable book, Armbruster chronicles how the international chemical cartel system run by Germany's IG Farben and its allies was used to rearm Germany after both World Wars. Armbruster described the powerful IG Corporation as a Kabbalistic organization which, through foreign subsidiaries and by secret tie-ups, operates a far-flung and highly efficient espionage machine, the ultimate purpose being world conquest and a world superstate directed by Farben. And when you get down to it, Farben and Standard Oil are the same company. In light of Armbruster's accusation that Farben operated a far-flung and highly efficient espionage machine, it should be noted that one of Farben's American lawyers, Alan Dulles, he shows up again, went on to head up the CIA following the war. The cruel and merciless policies which Farben implemented to create the Jewish Holocaust were summarized by Armbruster. These included such acts of criminal depravity as direct participation in the Nazi slave labor practices, which had their origin in the blackest periods of the slave trade, by which Farben war plants had been manned with forced labor of hapless captives in manufacturing and knowingly supplying the deadly poison gas used to murder millions of helpless human beings in the death chambers at Auschwitz, and after these mass murders in the conversion into fertilizer of the ashes remaining from the cremation of the corpses. Armbruster also relates how the Farben corporate directors, despite their ghastly crimes, were spared during the Nuremberg trials with the assistance of the American industrial elite, which participated in the collaboration with Farben. This elite was influential in the U.S. government agencies and committees responsible for developing the policies of reconstructing post-war Germany, policies which left the Farben-affiliated corporations relatively unscathed. Based on his extensive knowledge of Farben's history and goals, Armbruster made the following chilling prediction regarding Farben's uninterrupted agenda of global conquest in the post-World War II world. This creature may introduce that culmination of final world conquest for which Farben's leaders have already planned and made possible 2 world wars. Armbruster went on passionately to predict how Farben, in spite of the sacrifices made by the Allies to defeat the Nazi Empire in World War II, would quietly continue to rule from behind the scenes in the post-war world. Though a Farben-controlled superstate disguised as a union through a Farben-controlled superstate disguised as a union of nations. Of what avail a victory at arms with its ghastly sacrifice of sweat and blood and tears, of youth destroyed or warped or wrecked, if out of it shall come another piece of Farben's pattern, a peace disguised this time as a union of nations to rule by force with men of Farben's choice to make up that superstate. If that shall be the sacrifice and the victory and the profit, then this ghastly price will have been paid merely to yield our own destinies and those of all the world to the tender mercies of a supreme corporate state guided by men of Farben's choice, a union of nations as a super world government, which, call it by what name you will, in reality will be the consummation of the world's conquest, planned by faceless Farben figures to be consummated by Farben's faithless dupes. Armbruster's prediction that international humanitarian agencies, in quotes, such as the UN, a union of nations as a super world government, would merely be the tool of the hand-picked Farben elite may sound extreme until one realizes that in 1972 a former Nazi named Kurt Waldheim became the Secretary General of the UN for 10 years. And just what qualified Kurt Waldheim for service as the head of the UN, a recently released U.S. Justice Department report found that during Waldheim's service to the Nazi regime, he had, quote, assisted or participated in the transfer of civilian prisoners to the SS for exploitation as slave labor, the mass deportation of civilians to concentration and death camps, the deportation of Jews from the Greek islands in Banja Luka, Yugoslavia, to concentration and death camps, the deportation of Jews from Greek islands in Banja Luka, Yugoslavia, to concentration and death camps, the utilization of anti-Semitic propaganda, the mistreatment and execution of Allied prisoners, and reprisal execution of hostages and other civilians. Kurt Waldheim was not the only Nazi collaborator to achieve great power in international humanitarian institutions. Prior to Waldheim's election as Secretary General of the UN, John J. McCloy, a member of a law firm working for Farben in the U.S. prior to the war, an individual who personally presided over the reconstruction of post-war Germany, was put in charge of the World Bank. It was McCloy who prematurely released all the industrialists convicted at the Nuremberg trials, as well as numerous war criminals and mass murderers. In that last paragraph, he's actually saying that, and I think he's right, he's actually saying that John J. McCloy was a Nazi collaborator, which in effect he was.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, he's one of those characters that had a lot to do with what we're referring to as far as the transformation of the United States, and yet you don't really see his footprints around too much unless you go inside the beast. Right.
He's one of those individuals like Allen Dulles, Ann Prescott Bush, and Averell Harriman, who was always behind the scenes promoting this globalist agenda, the New World Order, so to speak. He's one of those people. In fact, maybe at some point, I don't know if you want to or not, but at some point we might have a program called the Nazi Hall of Fame. the American Nazi Hall of Fame.
Hall of Shame.
And we could kind of, give profiles on these individuals, and I think John J. McCoy would be one of the top guys, along with Dulles and Prescott Bush, Averill Harriman, and Henry Ford, and several others.
Yeah, when I hear all these names, and I think back to how many of them also were either central to or in and around the Kennedy assassination. I wonder if there was a divide between Kennedy, and his old man was obviously kind of a wicked guy.
Yeah, he was.
And he also was he was the ambassador to the court of King James in Britain.
Sure was.
Yeah. But
Roosevelt once said, well, he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. In relation to Joe Kennedy.
Well, and that's interesting, too, because here you've got a guy who would seem like one of the boys on another branch and backing Democrats rather than what we have seen. And I would think, I'm sorry to say, but it seems a majority of individuals you're talking about, if they had any political alliances, it was with Republicans. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if...
Well, you've got the Democrats too with Averill Harriman. The Harrimans have always been the godfathers of the Democratic Party.
True.
And you've got Roosevelt had some very questionable associations with a lot of people.
But that almost seems like and I'm not trying to force this into my schema, but it seems to me like there might have been two branches, not necessarily competitive, but when it came down to Kennedy. I don't know. I mean, there's some people who even think that FDR got assassinated.
I've heard that, and there was some probably some validity to those rumors. At least some reason to believe it. The Russians continuously said that
Churchill
they thought
did it.
He was assassinated.
Yeah, they said Churchill did it.
Yeah. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Well.
But I wouldn't trust Churchill any farther I could throw him. It's funny, growing up, he was always presented to us as what a great statesman, the guy who stood against the Nazis, rah. And then you start studying his life, and then you also notice that as soon as the war was over and he was up for election, he was soundly defeated by the British people. They didn't want him. Well,
it's the old story about somebody doing their job and then being removed. Mm-hmm. I'm not so sure that wasn't the plan in a sense.
Yeah.
He was pretty much a hatchet guy, and now that he did his dirty work, can we just it's like a Tom Horn. Tom Horn was a regulator, went after bad guys in the famous I guess what was that the war out in New Mexico between sod pushers and cattlemen and all this.
Yeah.
And once Tom did his job, it was like now we got to get rid of Tom.
Yeah,
I know that's a small microcosmic example, but then you look also at Napoleon. When Napoleon did whatever job was imparted to him, he gave up his army, as I'm sure directed, and they got rid of Napoleon.
Well, I think Hitler was the same way.
That's exactly right. Yep.
That was a project, that they set it up for the dialectic, and once Hitler had served his useful, time, he was off.
Or was he allowed to escape? See, that's the other thing.
He may have been allowed to escape. Some say that he escaped to Spain and then was taken by submarine to South America. I really don't know. I do know that some very high up Nazis, including Martin Bormann, escaped. They even faked up Bormann's death.
That episode you just mentioned about going to Spain. Mm-hmm. Yeah, who does that come from? Because I had him on and I thought he was totally bogus.
I've heard it from various sources. Okay. I'm not sure who you're talking about. But I've heard it. Yeah, it's hard to say. The Russians were never convinced, early on at least, they were never convinced that Hitler was dead. They thought he had escaped. There was what they call a doppelganger, a double that they did find. I've even seen film of that. There was some Russian film. I've got quite a few old documentary films that on DVD that I watched doing research, and they show this guy, and he looks an awful lot like Hitler. Of course, it's a corpse, but the facial features and the little mustache and the whole 9 yards very similar. And the Russians thought that this guy had been left to make them think Hitler was dead, and they became very suspicious. Of course, the Russians very paranoid of the West anyway, so it's kind of hard to say. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I mean, he's dead now anyway, thank God. So,
all right, the guys. All right, let me bring this back. I don't mean to bang on it, but
yeah,
Greg Hallett.
Greg Hallett. Heard the name before.
Right, he wrote a book about Britain and all this other stuff in World War II.
Oh, yeah. Is he the guy that said Hitler was a British agent or something?
Yeah, you know what? That might have been the title. Hitler was a British agent.
Yeah,
okay.
I read his stuff, and he's kind of out there in left field.
Well, everything's based on a certain unknown informant or source, and it's like, no, that was sensationalism.
I don't think his research is sound, and I think it's kind of sensationalism and a lot of crap, really.
So did I.
I mean, I don't know.
No, I agree. I mean, you can't go to bat with a work based that much on that. And I have to say, although we all like him, John Coleman does the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, you cannot corroborate it. I understand it. At some point, you can't get people to talk. I understand it all. But there is something unfortunate about the fact that you can't corroborate some of this stuff. And then you wonder, given the person's character, that they don't, underneath that guise of, well, I can't tell you, start roaming places where they, shall we say, should not go.
Right.
Hallett was bogus, in my estimation.
Yeah, there's quite a few of these people that will write a sensationalist book, but they can't back it up with real research. They can't back it up with quotations and documentation, you know, that it's not footnoted and it's, you know, so-and-so said, you know, in the bunker at the end, you know, and you don't, and where did you get this information? So-and-so's dead, you know. Notable sources, you know, sources close to the, you know, and it's not real historical research.